Well, good evening. I invite us to begin by acknowledging before Creator that we are here in Treaty 1 territory, the traditional land of Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojai Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Red River Métis Nation. And that we in Winnipeg regularly benefit from Treaty 3 water. And I welcome you to Marpeck Commons on the Canadian Mennonite University campus to CommonWord's book launch of Peaceful at Heart, Anabaptist Reflections on Healthy Masculinity. This is an evening of conversation with Don Neufeld, who served as co-editor of the book, Harry Lafond, one of its 18 contributors, and Dan Epp-Tiessen, an early collaborator. And I'm grateful that you're here from Ontario, Don, Saskatchewan, Harry, from Manitoba, Dan, and we're pleased that you have all come out this evening. My name is Arlen. I'm the director of CommonWord, a national Anabaptist bookstore and resource center, jointly operated by CMU and Mennonite Church Canada. The program tonight will largely go unannounced. Dan will begin by sharing some reflections on the importance of healthy masculinity and his journey with this project the past 5 years. Don, as editor, will provide his story behind the story, his vision for the book, and its binational Mennonite Men connection. Harry will share his journey as an Indigenous man and how peacefulness, having good relations, is an apt metaphor for healthy masculinity. These short presentations will be followed by a Q&A, a question and answer period, time for dialogue. After the program, the book will be sold at CommonWord for a special discounted price tonight of $35. Please stay around for a bit and visit. There's, of course, coffee and other refreshments at Folio. And you're free to come inside the store, browse a bit, and have your book signed by Don or Harry or others. Now, before Dan comes forward, I trust you've all signed out a door prize form, and we're going to raffle off one copy of the book. I'll let Don do it. Well, we'll give this over to Doug Clausen. And one more, we have a $10 Folio gift card.
Tell him to draw again. Should draw again.
Oh, fine. I'll give this to my daughter. There's a reason I don't hold this. Dan, welcome.
Well, I teach mostly Bible here at CMU, but one of the great joys of my life these last 20 years or so has been having the opportunity to co-teach a course with Irma Fastuik called Women and Men, in which we look at gender relationships from a biblical, theological perspective, also from a social science perspective. And I don't know how Don and I first started having these conversations, but Don found out that I'm interested in issues of masculinity and what healthy masculinity looks like. And he had this vision for this project. And so he invited me to collaborate with him on that project. And it was exhilarating to dream and brainstorm about what shape this project might take and what kind of articles and who we might invite as writers. But unfortunately, I had already committed myself to some other writing projects, and then I kept getting cancer, and so I had to withdraw from the project. But Don was very gracious, and he persevered, and I'm so grateful for that. And he found another person to work with as a co-editor, and I'm just so grateful that through Don's energy and perseverance, this project has seen the light of day. And in my comments, I want to focus my comments on 4 reasons why I think this book is important. And there's, of course, many, many more reasons, but I want to focus on 4. Number 1, there is a lack of good literature on healthy masculinity. You go to any major bookstore, and you go to the shelf, women's issues, and it's about this big, full of all kinds of wonderful books on issues related to womanhood, what it looks like to be a healthy woman. You have to ask where the men's book section is, and it's about this big, if it's that big. And it can hardly be a good thing that so many more women seem willing, even eager to reflect on the shape of healthy womanhood, femininity, than men seem to be willing. And the fact that there are just so few resources available. And so I think this book, Peaceful at Heart, it makes a very significant contribution to providing some good, solid, healthy literature on healthy masculinity that will hopefully encourage many men to read it and to reflect on their own lives and the lives of other boys and men. A second reason this book is so important, I think, is that it provides an important corrective to some of the Christian literature that is actually out there dealing with masculinity. In 2001, John Eldredge published Wild at Heart, Discovering the Secret of a Man's Heart. Now, unfortunately, this book has now sold 4 million copies and has been translated into 16 different languages. At least that's what Google told me yesterday. According to Eldredge, every man is a warrior at heart who needs to find a battle to fight, some danger to stare down, some wilderness to conquer. Boys and men are hardwired to love weapons and guns. And in order for men and boys to be healthy, they need to embrace that aspect of their being. The characters that Eldredge repeatedly holds up as role models are warriors, fighters, heroes, men who will kill other men, other people, in order to promote righteousness and justice in the world, men who will conquer wilderness, and so forth. And of course, every man wants to be a Prince Charming. And he uses exactly this vocabulary. Every man needs to find a beauty to rescue. 4 million copies of this book are out there, poisoning the minds of our boys and men. And the title of this book, Peaceful at Heart, is a deliberate poke at this book. Wild at Heart. According to Eldredge, aggressiveness and violence are a central aspect of masculinity, and men need to embrace that in order to be healthy. Peaceful at Heart suggests that men and boys move towards health and well-being and healthy masculinity as they become peaceful at heart, and as they embrace the peace that comes as a gift from Jesus Christ, and as they allow that peace to shape their hearts and their lives. And so this book, I think, is just a very important corrective, and it's a great contribution to have reflections on masculinity from an Anabaptist Mennonite peace perspective. A third reason I think this book, or a third way I think this book makes a significant contribution, is in terms of contributing to the literature on Anabaptist Mennonite peace theology. There is, of course, a large body of literature on Anabaptist Mennonite peace theology. Very little of that reflects on issues of masculinity. And the literature that does is written by female theologians. And of course, the elephant in the room here is John Howard Yoder. the great Mennonite peace theologian who is writing this, and it was wonderful Mennonite peace theology that I personally have benefited from so much. And he's writing this great peace theology while he's abusing women, hundreds of them. It is high time that we have a group of men reflecting from an explicitly Anabaptist perspective on what it might look like for Christian men to be truly peaceful at heart. And so this book makes a significant contribution, I think, to Anabaptist Mennonite peace theology. A fourth reason I think that I want to highlight is, I think just in its approach, this book is so important. I know from conversations with Don that he was committed right from the beginning to name and address the toxic forms of masculinity in our culture, but to do that without beating up on men. And to do that while still claiming the goodness of masculinity. And so yes, toxic forms, images of masculinity that are perpetuated in so many different ways in our culture, they damage and they wound the hearts and souls of our boys and our men. And it is out of this woundedness and brokenness that men hurt other people, children, women, other men in their lives. Hurting people do hurting things. And this book encourages men to embrace peacefulness as central to a journey towards a masculinity that is healthy and life-giving and nurturing for men themselves and also for the people that men are in relationship with. A masculinity that a man can be genuinely proud of and genuinely at peace with. So, there's lots more that could be said, but thank you so much, Don, for this book.
It's a real pleasure to have somebody else reflect back to me the value of the book, and thank you, Dan, for your comments. It is truly humbling to be at this point in a process of having authored or at least edited a book, something that I and my English teachers of the past would never have thought would happen. I would not have been someone who would have historically been one to take this kind of a project on, but am quite just awed by what's happened and want to acknowledge the many people who participated in getting this where it is today. This has been a 5-year process for me, back to June of 2014 when the inspiration came to me. And I will acknowledge Steve Heinrichs in the room, because it was soon after reading Buffalo Shout, Salmon Cry, and that model of bringing voices together that I got an inspiration to bring men's voices together and have a similar kind of dialogue. So that's part of where this came from. I'm grateful to Dan for those early conversations we had over here at the 500 Shaftesbury in one of the classrooms there, the summer of the Mennonite Church gathering here, when I pulled him aside and said, let's do some brainstorming. And for me, again, not knowing whether this was at all viable, whether this is the kind of thing that could ever be valuable, and whether I could be part of contributing to it, and having Dan's enthusiasm and his wisdom was part of what propelled this forward. The title was Dan's, and when he had to pull out of the project, he allowed me to take it with me and to use it for this project. Another really significant part tonight is having Harry Lafond here. Harry's name was given to me through Steve when I was looking for an Indigenous author to contribute, and because of internet and email and stuff like that, we collaborated, we got his chapter, and I had never met Harry until tonight. So it's a thrill to see Harry. When I received his chapter, his draft back in April of 2018, I was moved to tears by the story that Harry shared, and I look forward to hearing some more of his comments tonight. The breadth of authors that came together in this collection represent many perspectives, some more personal and reflective of their own challenges of masculinity in their own contexts, some more theological and pastoral. My colleague and co-editor Steve Thomas of Goshen, Indiana, who is the coordinator of Mennonite Men in the U.S., joined partway through, a while after Dan was needed to withdraw, and I was sort of carrying it on my own. Steve came on board at that point as the U.S. coordinator of Mennonite Men, and I was part of the board. And as I reflected with Steve about my dream, he came on board and was a natural fit to expand the project. Being from the States and having extensive networking and also years of work with Mennonite men's groups was a natural fit and greatly enriched and expanded the project. Right from the beginning, one of my intentions was to ensure that this was a book by men for men. And Dan mentioned that passion that I had to ensure that the approach was one that was affirming of men and invited men to a conversation, not primarily like I had experienced as a social worker at that point for probably about 20 years, where men were primarily identified as a problem. And the outreach to men was primarily as perpetrators or as potential threats, and knowing that it was going to be hard enough to engage men, if that was the tone, that would send men packing really quickly. So the intention was to make it an inviting place for men to come and join the dialogue. The inclusion of 3 women as respondents was meant to carry the conversation forward, not as permission or endorsement. It actually was a bit of a discussion that I had right from the beginning when Institute for Mennonite Studies came on board. They were quite insistent on having some women's voices, and it took a while for me to even warm up to the idea of having women involved for that specific reason. Again, not that I have any issue with women being involved in the conversation, but it was very much about creating a male positive, male ownership approach to the topic. More than celebrating the publication at this point, I invite all of you, and I hope readers into the future, to join on a journey on the quest for healthy masculinity. This is not to say that the past is a story of only unhealthiness. Most men have acted in good faith according to the understandings of healthy masculinity that have been in place through the years, contributing in wonderful ways to their families, their church communities, and to society at large. Rather, it is to suggest that we can do better, both in men's lives individually and also in the lives of those whose lives we touch. As it concerns the grievous behaviors of some men over history, and as it concerns the systemic understandings and perspectives, including the contributions of Christian thought, we can do better. My contention from the genesis of this book is that we as Anabaptists have a particular and relevant contribution to make to this conversation from our faith perspective. As men within our Mennonite communities, we cannot claim to be a particularly compelling model of masculinity to date, which is why we must start in conversations with our own men and in our churches. And maybe along the way, bring that sense or that idea of a peace theology into the larger Christian community and maybe even beyond. Far too much evidence exists for the lack of peace within men's lives and the impacts of the lack of peace in the world. Mennonite Men is an organization that many of you may or may not be familiar with. It's a binational organization of both Mennonite Church Canada and Mennonite Church USA, and historically has been primarily focused on raising funds for grants for emerging churches and their purchase of their first worship space. Periodically through the years, Mennonite Men as an organization has ventured into conversations about men's spirituality, the last such initiative being 10 years ago with the publication of Under Construction by Gareth Brandt from BC. Peaceful at Heart represents a significant shift into a more intentional work with men around issues of spirituality and healthy living as men. We are already working on a further resource. Steve and I have been brainstorming, and we have actually secured 2 grants already to support the development of another publication that will be more of a manual that can be used in small groups or in retreat settings. The intention is that it will be translated ultimately into French and Spanish, and at the invitation of churches in Zimbabwe, the intention is that it will be translated into Swahili to be brought to Africa to be used as a resource there. Steve was there on a Mennonite Men tour, and the men in Zambia or in Zimbabwe just were very insistent that we do something that they can then use in their communities also. So that is just something very exciting, a little bit awe-inspiring as far as what that might ultimately look like. But the potential to take the work that we are committed to internationally is something that is very intriguing at this point. So the invitation is there to join the conversation. I understand there's a group here from one of the local churches who are already delving in to the book and to hopefully carry that conversation further, and I look forward to hearing feedback. We're going to have a bit of time of QA after question and answer after Harry comes up, and I look forward to questions. I also make myself available to anybody who would like to reach out to me ongoing, both as part of Mennonite Men, but just personally, if you have any kind of ideas, questions, thoughts, interest in being involved in the dialogue or in the work of Mennonite Men, please do be in touch with me. Look forward to hearing from you. At this point, I'm going to invite Harry to come forward and to share some of his thoughts about what he has reflected on in the book.
Well, nigan tatamskat na te nanaskum te na te petaksinik. So in the Cree way, I'm saying thank you very much. I thank you for being here and for welcoming me into your community. I'm a Cree man. I come from central Saskatchewan, middle of Treaty 6 territory. I've lived in my reserve community all most of my married life deliberately. I could have lived anywhere in Canada. I could have become an urban Indian. I could have been successful at it. But I chose to live in my own community because I felt that it was the place that was right for me to explore my own history, my own spirituality, and create an environment for the next generation, my 5 children. Winnipeg, in many ways, is a connecting point of who I am and the history of my family. And I say this for this reason. The Lafon man who left Montreal and headed west came through Winnipeg, and no doubt stopped here, and eventually made his way to Saskatchewan. And so Saskatchewan, we have Lafon's. My great-grandfather lived just south of here, hunted buffalo, eventually found his way to Batoche, wandered around Batoche because the spirit of a buffalo hunter could not settle into one place. And so that's where my mother came from. My grandfather that I never knew, never met, discovered very late in life, is buried here, just across the river at Elmwood. He was a German. He was the father of my grandmother. But we never knew him because he was Protestant and my Métis were Roman Catholic. And in those days, they didn't talk to each other. And so I say, Winnipeg is like coming home, historically. I've got connections here. When they asked me to participate in this project, I've always shied away from writing anything. Probably because I went to university and they're forever demanding essays for everything. And some of them were pretty painful. I did a master's thesis that took me about 5 years, and they had to threaten me with discontinuation to finish it. So I finished it, and for a long time I just let that typewriter sit idle. So when I was invited to participate in this project, it was a major decision on my part. And I put it off for the longest time until Don kept sending these emails, when is it coming? And finally, one Sunday afternoon, I sat down at my computer and I wrote everything in one sitting. It was a long sitting, but it was the only way I could do it. I'd had to, once the thought processes began to take form on my computer, I just felt I had to finish it, and that's how it came about. Now, in terms of how I moved through that story, I don't know if you're familiar with the artist Alan Shope. He is a simple Cree man from Red Pheasant First Nation and just outside of North Battleford. When I was in high school, I would run across Alan Shope. He was on the street. He'd be selling his paintings, for $5, $10. Just eventually he became famous, world famous, and his art hangs in many homes and many galleries. But he continued to be a simple man, enjoying life, telling the story of his people. He has one painting that I think speaks to my participation here. It's a painting about this big, and it's looking out from inside the log house. And at the door is a little child about a year and a half, just learning how to walk. And just outside the door is a man, simple man, and he's hunched down to be at the same height as the 1-year-old, and he's got his hands out. And beautiful painting. Lots of sunlight, lots of color, but it's the gesture gesture of that man is what caught my attention. And I wanted to know, how do I become like that man? What is the spirit of that man that is reaching out? Because he embodies the Cree word that tells us or explains to us that gesture. Oh, Piginawasoin is a Cree word, and it's packed with teachings. It's the word that describes the relationship between a child and a parent. And inside of that word is this spirituality of lifting this child. You raise him up. There's no reference to owning the child. It's all about the child being lifted and the responsibility that comes to the lifter, the one that's been gifted with that child. That's where I wanted to be. And so when I started taking a look at men in my family, my grandfathers, the ones that came from, some of them that came from here, the ones that I knew, and my own father, and I'm watching my older brothers. I'm at the tail end of 12 children, so I had lots of chances to watch my own family become adults. I realized that in order for me to become Alan Sapp's image of fatherhood, that I had to understand where I came from and why I was finding it so hard to be the loving, affectionate father that I needed to be. And so I went back, and my mother was a storyteller, told us all kinds about family history, so I had that in the back of my head all the time. And I remember the one story, I think the genesis of this brokenness. And I checked back in the church record books, and sure enough, back in about 1885, there was a Catholic priest named Lafon came to our community. And when he left, he had with him a 6-year-old boy. That was my grandfather on my dad's side. And he took him from where I live now all the way to Calgary to put him in a residential school there. And that's where he stayed until he was 19, 20 years old. Never came home. When he finally found his way home, it was to a family that he didn't know, brothers and sisters that had been born that he didn't know. And that's where I came from. That's where my dad came from. That's where my brothers came from. It came from that disconnection, and that disconnection just kind of multiplied itself over time. And so my dad was, he didn't go to residential school. I think he went 2 years, and he was an epileptic, and they sent him home. But he had a very difficult life. And we grew up in a home where he provided for us. He was a farmer. But he also would go to town, and he would come home, and he would be drunk. And when he got drunk, he would get angry, and so we lived through this. And so by the time I was a young teenager, I had a great dislike for my dad. I feared his temper. He never hit us, but he yelled at us a lot. And so this is what was feeding me as a man. And so by the time I was an adult and I had married and I was having our first child, I had a very difficult time knowing how to behave. And for the first 2 or 3 years, and I've apologized to my son, because he became my experiment, I guess, in being a dad, and it wasn't a good experiment, because it was the world was black and white, and he needed to behave. I was very strict. And thank goodness I had a wife that was more understanding, and I had a mother that would shake her head at me. By the time the second child came, I was beginning to change, and it came through a lot of hard work. Relationship building is hard work, because we have to deal with so many hurts in here. And we have to let go of things parts of us that we've lived with for a long time, and we've led ourselves to believe that it's the right way, so we have to let them go. We have to have that humility. And thank goodness for the women in our lives. In my life, I was able to make that transition. So number five in my family benefited from all of these experiences. By the time he came along, I was a different person. We never experienced hugging in my family. We never experienced the word, I love you, in my family. It wasn't there. It wasn't part of our family culture. But number 2 son, number 1 daughter, number 2 daughter, number 5, they have taught me how to say I love you. And it is such a wonderful thing. It's a wonderful way to have become. And I think I have this sense that I'm getting closer to be Alan Sapp's man. I want to be that warm. And I want to continue to open my grandchildren, and I work hard at it. And my wife and I, that's our number 1 goal as we get older. Our grandchildren, we stay in contact, we build relationships with them, and we'll continue to do that. So when we say peaceful at heart, that's what peaceful at heart means to me. It's striving to be the man that God intended me to be, despite, a very broken history. I did reconcile with my dad. And I was lucky. I was very lucky. He and my mother needed somebody to take care of them. That's why I ended up in Muskeg. And I moved. Jermaine and I agreed, yeah, we'll do it. And we went there. And I was able to spend the last years of my dad's life living right next door. And we rebuilt He had given up drinking by then, and we built a relationship, as father and son. And I'm forever thankful to the Creator for giving us that second chance. And that's the way, I think he died peaceful at heart for that chance that we had together. And he got to know my children while we were there. So, thank you very much.